All right, well, thank you very much for having me. This will be fun. And as Meredith told you, I'm a professor of early Christianity. I specialize primarily in the New Testament and teach classes on the New Testament and its background. So Second Temple Judaism, Greek and Roman culture, and the Greek and Latin languages. So this is the sort of thing that I love talking about. And I understand you guys are a highly educated audience, so the expectations are very high. All right, and as Meredith said, she looked through my PowerPoint, and it's long, and we don't have to do all of it, but it's all there, and we'll hit what we have time for. So we're talking about the historical situatedness of the Bible. So we're already using kind of fancy words, but it's really not that complicated. The Bible was written in a particular time, particular place, in an environment with a culture quite distant from our own, but that if we understand it, we can, I think, understand the Bible a little bit better. It's not showing yet. It's okay. I'm just going to pause because the PowerPoint isn't showing. There we go. There we go. Situatedness. That's how you spell that. Okay, so there's the Bible flying through space into Earth. And I think that this is the way a lot of people think about the Bible, sort of unreflectively, right? That this is it's a message from God that was kind of sent directly from him, and what isn't part of history and a story that happened here in a particular part of the world. And so to understand the Bible, I think, for one, understanding geography is very important, very helpful as you read through the Bible. It puts it in context for you. You can also follow the narrative a lot easier. So we're going to have quite a few maps. We're going to talk quickly through the chronology of the Bible.
They're also going to have a whole week on geography later. So,
okay.
You can still do your maps. I'm just
No.
saying, like, they're going to have a whole week on geography. So
Okay, good, because I was most excited about the maps. So. Okay.
We're slow learners.
I don't believe that. Okay, so we're going to have two parts to this tonight. So the first part is the Old Testament part, because Meredith asked me to cover the whole Bible. So this is the Old Testament part, and here we're going to focus on the Bible as a historical narrative. So it's a narrative, but it's also historical, but how understanding the arc of the story helps set up the New Testament and why Jesus was so surprising to people. So I assume that most of you know more or less the contents of the Old Testament, but let me just hit the high points of the story. Of course, God creates the heavens and the earth and everything in it. Humanity falls away from God, and God tries to start over with a people. He says, this is going to be a people for myself. So he calls Abraham, says, I'm going to give you a land that will be yours and will belong to you and your people that I will make numerous. These are the patriarchs, Abraham and his son Isaac and Jacob. So flash forward, I'm going to hit just another high point. Eventually, they get to the land that God has promised them, and they have a king. And the best of these was David. There was a united kingdom under David, and then again under his son Solomon. But things went badly from there, and the kingdom divides, and you have a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. And eventually, both kingdoms are going to fall, and the temple is going to be destroyed, and they will be sent out into exile. That's the story in big outline. The two kingdoms fall, the first in 722 BC to the Assyrians, and the second, the southern kingdom, in 587 to the Babylonians. And when the Babylonian destruction occurred, the temple was also destroyed, and the Jews were sent out into exile into Babylon, but they also spread abroad into other places as well. Exiles from the land that God had promised them. So we always do, Dora the Explorer.
Oh my God.
Yeah, so we have map time each time, and I think a lot of the students grew up with Dora, so there you go. Okay, so here's a map. Y'all know what this sea is right here? Starts with an M. The Mediterranean Sea, and I know you all know where Italy is and Greece, modern-day Turkey. But here you see the two rivers. What do we call the land between the two rivers? It literally is the land between two rivers. Mesopotamia, it means the land between two rivers. And this is where Babylon is in the south, and Assyria. And it's these kingdoms that grow and spread and eventually come southwest into I'm trying to find my cursor, into the land of Israel. So by the way, if you are looking for maps, great resource. This is the first resource I'm going to show you. BibleOdyssey.org, sponsored by the Society of Biblical Literature. Among the many, many tools they have there and articles, they have a map section. And you'll have these slides as well, so in case you don't have time to write it down. So here's a map that I got from there. The divided kingdom. We have the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. So, the Israelites are off in exile, where? Here, in Babylon. Also, a community of Jews went down into Egypt and apparently into Libya and into Syria. We have evidence of Jews in a lot of different locations after the exile occurred. This is the diaspora of the Jewish people, and it's very important to the story. Okay? But the Babylonians fall to the Persians. And there's a king named Cyrus who says, all you Jews, I don't know why the Babylonians are being so mean to you, y'all come on home to your land. This is the Edict of Cyrus that occurred in 539 BC. So as you see now, what had belonged to the Babylonians, now the Persian Empire is more massive than any empire that had ever existed at the time. But they are friendlier to the Jews early on. So the Jews will return from exile. Not everybody, but many Jews will return in waves to their land that God had promised Abraham and his descendants, and they will rebuild the temple that had been destroyed in 587. And this introduces what's called the Second Temple period. That's when the Second Temple was built, 515 BC. The Persians eventually are defeated by the Greeks, and it's just another era of foreign domination for the people of Israel. As you see there's the kingdom of Alexander the Great, a Greek who came from Greece and Macedonia, introducing Greek culture all over the world, further east than the Persian Empire had been, introducing the Greek language, Greek religion, Greek philosophy, Greek political structures, and all of that influenced the Jewish homeland, and many Jews will begin to speak Greek, and fewer will speak Hebrew. This is known as the Hellenization of the world. Alexander introducing Greek culture everywhere. Okay? Eventually the Greeks will wane, and the Romans will come into power, moving from west to east, taking out all of this Greek territory over the course of several centuries. During the Roman era, the Second Temple is destroyed in 70 AD, never to be rebuilt. That's the end, technically, of the Second Temple period. So all of that story, just hitting some of the high points, sets up the New Testament and the expectations that the Jewish people have for redemption and what it will look like. So some questions that they've been troubled about, have been reflecting on and writing very much about, which I'll talk about in a second. Has God cast away his people? What did God promise? Well, you're going to be my people, and I'm going to give you a land, and you'll be free to be my people and obey your law in it. Well, over and over and over again, foreign powers have come in and dominated you, and now exiled you from the land that you were promised. So will God eventually vanquish these oppressors? Most recently, the Romans, who were in power during the birth of Jesus. Will those who were sent into exile return? If the whole point was that we would be God's people in a land, redemption ought to look like restoration of God's people in the land. Will we have a Davidic king again? So King David, the second and best of the kings under a united monarchy. We continue to have a king in the line of David up until the Babylonian exile, beginning in 587. The king of Israel is sent off into exile, and you have no Davidic king from that point. So will a king in the line of David return? Will there be a Messiah, an anointed one that God will raise up to redeem us? Not everybody believed there would be a Messiah, a single figure that would have this role. And of those that did, they asked what their redemption might look like. What is it that this Messiah might do? What is salvation, in short, for us? So some of you may have studied enough to understand a little bit about what Jews expected of a Messiah around the time of Jesus. What impressions do you have, or what have you heard about what Jews expected the Messiah to be when Jesus came on the scene?
Messiah mentioned in the Old Testament by somebody, one of the prophets or somebody who talked about, was it Isaiah? Okay.
Yeah, there are a lot of different passages that are interpreted messianically. They don't always use the term Messiah. Sometimes they use a term like the branch of David or Prince of Peace and things like that.
He's supposed to conquer everything.
Yeah, I mean, what would you expect? If you're a Jew and you were promised this land and you don't have it, and you have this foreign power that's telling you how to live your life that's different than the way that you would like to live your life and God told you to live your life, then probably what you're most hoping for would be some kind of warrior figure to rise up and throw off the yoke of these foreign oppressors. Now, not all Jews would have felt that way. A lot of Jews would have been well assimilated into their communities and so forth, but a lot of them would not have been. And Rome was in many ways very ruthless. And so sometimes the kind of simplification is made by historians that Jews expected a warrior Messiah to come and destroy the Romans. And there is a lot of truth to that. But that's not the only expectation that people had about the Messiah, or the only way people were thinking about what this Messiah would look like. So this is where the second part of our background comes in. How would we know what Jews in the first century were expecting the Messiah to look like?
Paintings and caves.
Drawings? Okay, so archaeology.
Tapestry.
Tapestry?
Scrolls.
Yeah, so archaeology, so scrolls, literature, other than the Bible. I mean, the New Testament is a great source for what Jews were expecting, but it focuses really on the resolution to the problem more than it does lay out kind of the expectations that people had. So where would we go to learn about their expectations? Well, there's a whole lot of literature that was written by Jews during the Second Temple period, and a whole lot of it between the 1st century BC and 1st century AD, that tells us what Jews were thinking, whether they were happy with the situation or not, whether they felt there needed to be a king in the line of David return, whether they wanted a warrior Messiah or were even thinking about a Messiah at all. So there's a Bible that's published by Oxford University. It's the New Revised Standard Version translation, but it adds what Protestants call the Apocrypha, but which you may know Catholics call Deuterocanon. These are other Jewish writings from that period that for Catholics hold an authoritative status as part of the Bible. And among those books, 1st and 2nd Maccabees tell a very important part of the story about the Greek period. In addition to the Apocrypha are a number of other writings called pseudepigrapha that have been collected, not all of them, in James Charlesworth's 2 volumes of the Old Testament pseudepigrapha. So there are volumes and volumes and volumes of Jewish literature that was written between the time that the Old Testament ends and the time of Jesus and the growth of the early church that tells us what Jews were thinking, what were they feeling, what were they disagreeing about, because not all Jews were thinking the same way. And so when it comes to Jesus' question, if you remember in the Gospels, he asks his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they say, "Well, some people say you're John the Baptist, or some people say you're Elijah." He says, "Well, who do you say that I am?" And Peter says, "You are the Messiah," which sounds at first like a very clear answer, and Peter has correctly identified Jesus' identity. But the question is, does Peter really know what kind of Messiah Jesus was? And based on our understanding of the literature of the time, it is likely that Peter and many of the disciples felt that this had a strong warrior component to it. But I have a passage here that shows you that Jews also thought the Messiah was going to do some other sort of spiritual things. This comes from a text called the Psalms of Solomon. It is referring to the King Solomon, but he didn't really write it. It's a 1st century BC writing. But it tells us what some Jews of the period were thinking. And it refers to the anointed one, that's the Messiah, but it refers to the Messiah as one that will discipline God's own people, not destroy the nations, but discipline God's own people. If you look at the final part in red, in wisdom of spirit and of righteousness and strength, to direct a man in works of righteousness and fear of God, to establish them all before the Lord, a good generation in fear of God in the days of pity. So while many Jews probably were expecting almost exclusively something like a warrior Messiah that would destroy the enemies, there were others who were very much concerned with the problem of sin and Israel's turn away from God, and believed that this Messiah would be one that would return them back to the Lord. Okay, so that's the end of the first part, so I can pause for questions and comments on that. Yes.
I have a question. Is there anything in the Dead Sea Scrolls that point to this also?
Yes, there's a lot. And that's a good example of how different groups of Jews thought from each other. Because the Dead Sea Scrolls comes from a community, a very small community that lived on the shores of the Dead Sea, that believed they alone were true Israel, that other Jews were not true Israel, that this community was true Israel. And they had a very unique idea that there might even be two Messiahs, and one would be a warrior Messiah or a kingly Messiah, and the other one would be a priestly Messiah. So the Messiah who was to come would have to do a couple different things, and one would be more kind of administering the worship, and the other would be a warrior figure. And you find that all over the Dead Sea Scrolls. But their views exactly aren't shared, as far as we can tell, by many other Jews at the time. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I have some other resources listed here that include something called the Anchor Bible Dictionary. It's 6 volumes. It's a little expensive, but it's a really great resource to have if you have the money. So I think it's about $600. You can get it in electronic format, I think, for like $350. So this is if you're really serious about it. Okay, let's go to part 2 then.
Is that in the library?
In the local library?
Houston Public Library?
I seriously doubt it. Yeah. That would be really, really cool if it was. Okay, so that's part 1. Part 2, let's do the New Testament. So the Apostle Paul, now we're using another word like situatedness, but now we're using the word occasional, and I'm using it in a kind of special sense here. And I'll explain in a second. So the New Testament, as we know, begins with the birth of Jesus, probably around 6 BC. Jesus' ministry, death, resurrection, the growth of the early church by the apostles, one of whom is the Apostle Paul, who's converted after Jesus' death. And he sets upon himself by divine commissioning to travel around the world preaching the good news, not just to Israel, but to the Gentiles, which is a very radical move that irked many Jews of the time, because Israel was God's people, not the Gentiles. If the Gentiles want to be God's people, they need to become Jews in order to be God's people. Paul disagreed with that part of it. So he travels on these missions that we know about through letters that he wrote to the churches that he evangelized, and through the book of Acts in the New Testament. And these missions that we have letters from are primarily from the 50s of the first century. By the way, 1 Thessalonians, his letter to the Thessalonian church, probably the first of the New Testament documents to be written. It's the earliest document, written before the Gospels as well. So, after evangelizing Corinth in Greece. He traveled on some more missions, and eventually he wrote a letter that we call 1 Corinthians. But to give you a little bit more detail on that, he founded the church in Corinth in the year 51 AD. And we hear about the account in Acts chapter 18. He stayed there for 18 months, which tells you that things went pretty well for him, not like his visit to many other cities that ended very quickly with beatings. And so this church seemed to have flourished, and it also means that church probably did not experience significant persecution at the time, and may have been really well integrated with non-Christians in their society, which probably led to some of the problems that Paul is going to address in his letter to them. So he leaves after 18 months. He travels east, then west again back to Ephesus. And just so that you can follow this, if you were reading the book of Acts, and of course Corinth is here, he travels back towards Antioch and then back up to Ephesus here in Western Asia Minor. He actually writes a first letter to them that we do not have anymore, but that we know about because he refers to it in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. We call that letter A, not 1 Corinthians, because we have another letter that we call 1 Corinthians, which is actually letter B, the second letter to the church, that he wrote after receiving some troubling information about the happenings there. He received a letter from the Corinthians themselves that talked about some of the problems, and he received an oral report from somebody he calls Chloe's people. Okay, so a pause again. You have the Anchor Bible Dictionary that I mentioned. A great, more affordable option if you're studying Paul is something called the Dictionary of Paul and His Letters. The second edition just came out a couple of months ago. It's a right big book, but you can probably get it for $50, something like that. It's a reference resource. You don't read it cover to cover. So if you were studying Paul's letter to the Corinthians and you wanted sort of an overview of how that church came to exist and what was in that letter, there would be an article on Corinthians. You would look in alphabetical order, and you would find an article that says Corinthians, first letter to thee, and there's about an 8-page article about that letter that tells you about the background, when it was written, why it was written, and so forth. Okay, so what is first? How many people have read 1 Corinthians closely enough to kind of remember? What are the issues? What's the main issue in chapters 1 through 4? Okay, well, he begins by saying that the church is divided, and they know that they're divided, but he begins by reminding them that they're divided and pleading with them to be united again. He then goes on for the next several chapters to decry some form of wisdom that he refers to as human wisdom, that is very much opposed to the wisdom of God, the wisdom of the cross. And so it's at the beginning he announces this. He says, there are quarrels among you. And what I mean is that each of you says, I belong to Paul, or I belong to Apollos, or I belong to Cephas. Who's Cephas? Peter. Same guy. Cephas is the Aramaic name for Peter. Or I belong to Christ. So these are sometimes called the Corinthian factions or the Corinthian parties. And all kinds of debates about the nature of these parties, or whether there were 4 of them, or whether they were really this clear cut. But for our purposes, we'll just say there were something like factions, and they had favorites. And they're a group that had Paul as their favorite, or Apollos or Cephas as their favorite. Those who had Christ as their favorite were the real Christians. Now, actually, you can tell here that Paul is not happy with them either for some reason. So then he goes on to talk about this wisdom, this human wisdom that's so problematic that they seem to espouse. They think that they have this wisdom, and what we want to know is what it's all about, because it would be easy to get the wrong impression about this and Paul's understanding of wisdom and its importance. He talks in the first chapter about this wisdom, and he quotes from the Old Testament. I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? And so on for 3 chapters. Now, reading this apart from the historical situation, one could easily, and I think people have, come to the conclusion that this means we shouldn't seek higher education, shouldn't go to college, shouldn't go to graduate school, shouldn't study, shouldn't do science, right? The wisdom of humanity is wrong. What we need is the wisdom of God. We need to read the Bible. We need to pray. And probably instinctively you're thinking that there's something wrong with that. But how do we know that that's not what Paul is talking about? Well, when we start to consider that this document was not written directly to us or to the church through the last 2 millennia, but to a particular congregation in the year 54 in the city of Corinth that was divided into factions over some kind of wisdom. They're calling themselves wise men. So the question in looking at 1 Corinthians 1 through 4 that I think will help us understand a little better what it is that Paul opposes is, what is this wisdom? What kind of wisdom is it that these Corinthians have adopted in this city? And what is the connection between this wisdom and those party allegiances? I'm of Paul, and I'm of Apollos, and I'm of Cephas. So this is what we mean when we talk about Paul's letters as occasional. They weren't written to us, although they're very useful to us, and they're part of our Bibles now. They were written to particular churches on a particular occasion. They're occasional letters. So if we want to know the occasion of the letter, well, there are certain things that we aren't privy to because Paul doesn't say it. But the church and Paul share an understanding of what's happened. It's the backstory. It's like listening to one side of a phone conversation, right? We're reading somebody else's mail. If we're listening to somebody else's phone conversation, there's a certain amount of information that we can get about the situation being discussed, but we don't get everything. And so when we're reading someone else's mail, i.e. The Corinthians' mail, to understand what Paul is addressing, you have to do a certain amount of mirror reading. In other words, looking at what Paul says, you can reflect back indirectly towards what seems to be probably or possibly is the situation. It can be very speculative, but if you want to understand the background, you have to do it to some degree. 1 Corinthians is also interesting because we can determine something about what the Corinthians believed by the fact that Paul quotes them on a number of occasions. And I'm going to show you one of those places in a second. He also embeds throughout chapters 1 through 4 a lot of different kind of key words that the Corinthians were throwing about. Besides the word wisdom, wise man. They were calling themselves wise men. Some of them were calling themselves spiritual and mature. And knowing where Paul is quoting them is difficult. But there are a number of ways that we can try to extrapolate that information. So when we have this information, and then we have an understanding of the Greco-Roman world that the Corinthians and Paul lived in, we can begin to build or reconstruct a picture of a likely occasion behind the letter. Are you following? Okay, so if we mirror read, well, part of this is really easy. Paul says, I plead with you guys that you be united. Each of you says, I belong to Paul and I belong to Paul. So that part's easy. We know that they're divided. How do we know that some of them think that they're wise and have adopted the wisdom of the world? Well, he doesn't say, you guys think you're wise and adopted the wisdom of the world, but why would he talk about it if they didn't call themselves wise? This is what we mean by mirror reading. We can determine that in this wisdom has something to do with, or implies that some of them have a different status, i.e. spiritual status, than others in the community. Some are wise and some are not. These are the same people that think that they are spiritual and that others are not. So they divided the church into these spiritual tiers. Okay, so that's the mirror reading component in trying to reconstruct the situation. I referred to Corinthian slogans, places where Paul quotes the Corinthians. There's one in 1 Corinthians 6:12 that scholars pretty much unanimously agree is a quotation of the Corinthians. And if you look at your Bibles, most of your Bibles will have this in quotation marks. All things are lawful for me. And then the response, but not all things are beneficial. If you look at the second one out of the NIV, it says, I have the right to do anything you say, but not everything is beneficial. What needs to be understood about about the decision that the translators have made is that in the original Greek, there was no punctuation or spacing. So how do we know to put this in quotation marks? Well, the NIV says that it says you say. Well, actually, those words aren't in the original Greek text. What's in the original Greek text is all things are lawful for me, but not all things are beneficial. So how do we know that part of that is a slogan and the other part is a response? Well, without getting into all of it, there are a number of ways that scholars have determined that that's what's going on. But here, your translators have made that decision for you. And this is a place where if you're checking your notes in your Bible, it probably some of your Bibles, especially if it's a study Bible, will indicate that. That we think that Paul is quoting the Corinthians here, even though there's no punctuation in the original Greek. Is anybody looking at a Bible that doesn't have this in quotation marks? 1 Corinthians 6:12. What's the translation?
It's just the American Standard, the New American.
New American Standard, yeah. And that's probably because the New American Standard Bible is intended to be the most literal, word-for-word type translation. They're trying to do as little interpretation for you as possible while still giving you the meaning of the words. So that doesn't surprise me in that case. But there are a number of these. In 6:13 also, your Bible probably has that in quotation marks. Possibly in 6:18, 8:1, 8:4, and 8:8. So there are a number of these so-called Corinthian slogans. So when we look at these, you can begin to reconstruct a little bit the position of the Corinthians and what kind of wisdom this might have been that Paul is opposing. So here, resources, multiple Bible translations. Instead of just using one, have two or three by your side. And if one of them looks like it says something funny or gives you a funny note, check another translation and see what it does. And comparing these, sometimes you'll see differences. And those differences really just alert you to the fact that there might be a difficult interpretive issue that you need to study further. Not that any translators are trying to trick you. They're very good at what they do, and they're all doing their best to get it right. But comparing them will show you where the more difficult passages might be. Okay, wisdom, wise man, we know that. So I've added a lot here that we're not going to be able to go over. And probably the reason there's so much, and Meredith and I were talking about this, you go to school and you're taught how to pick everything apart, and you're not looking at the forest, you're looking at the leaves and all the different kinds of leaves and the different colors, and then you have to go and talk about this with people that aren't as interested in it or haven't done nearly as much study about it as you have, and you have to make it make sense in a short amount of time. And that's why the PowerPoint is too long, because I've spent too much time thinking about this particular topic. I've worked a lot on the background of 1 Corinthians, in particular, what is this wisdom that the Corinthians have adopted? And I'll give you the main outline of my thesis in a second. But what I'm going to propose is that it has something to do with Greek philosophy, a kind of Greek philosophy known as Stoicism. So we talked a little bit about Second Temple Jewish literature. If you're interested in knowing about the way Greek and Roman people thought, and Greek and Roman culture and history, there's a great series called the Loeb Classical Library that's especially appealing to people that know Greek and Latin, because it includes the Greek and Latin text with English translation on the facing pages. But anybody who's history nerd, ancient philosophy nerd, you might enjoy reading some of these. Some that are especially relevant to this issue in 1 Corinthians are the philosophical writings of Cicero, the letters of Seneca, the orations of Epictetus, and so on. So the red volumes have Latin and English, and the Greek volumes are Greek and English. So there you go. So based on my study of the ancient world, I argue, without being able to prove that to you looking at the details, that the Corinthians have adopted an understanding of Paul's message through the framework of Greek Stoic philosophy. And the Stoics had this idea of what they called the wise man. Not just somebody who's wise, but this very specific idea about the wise man as the perfect human being, embodied perfection, and was the most virtuous paradigm of humanity that could exist. And in some ways, it was almost an idealized theoretical figure because it was so hard to achieve. I think that some in the Corinthian church, not everybody, that some, those who were calling themselves wise men, were styling themselves after the Greek philosopher, the Stoic wise man. And I base that on a lot of different things in the text, part of which are the descriptors that Paul uses to describe them in different places. The Stoics would say only the wise man is rich, only the wise man is king, only the wise man is free. And all of that they meant in a more spiritual or intellectual sense, not in an ordinary kind of social or economic sense. And you see Paul using these same descriptions. We know they called themselves wise men, but he says this here in 4:8, already you've become rich, already without us you have become kings. And then a little later, you are wise, you are strong, you are held in honor. These are all words that the Stoics used to describe their wise man. Okay, so that's the wisdom in big summary. The other part of it, remember, is how does the wisdom relate to the factions? Some say I'm of Paul, and some say I'm of Apollos. I argue that the way that the Paul party is viewing Paul is similar to the way that philosophers in different philosophical sects viewed their teachers, which was a very partisan, dogmatic kind of approach that said, if I'm a Stoic, I only believe what the founding Stoic Zeno believed. And I believe it because that's what he said. And so some of the Corinthians probably were educated in Stoic philosophy, again, I think for reasons that we don't have time to go into, that then viewed Paul as like a new philosophical teacher, that essentially with his community was founding a new philosophical school that for them sounded a lot like Stoicism. I end up calling it sub-Stoicism. But that's the idea. And so when they say, I am of Paul, that party had this attitude of philosophical allegiance. I have some texts here that talk a little bit about that dynamic in the philosophical schools. So here's the idea in summary. So the party slogans, particularly when they say, I'm of Paul, is akin to what ancient philosophers did when they swore allegiance to the founding teacher of their school. That the Corinthians then interpreted Paul's teaching through the framework of Stoic philosophy because it sounded a lot like it in many ways for reasons we can't go into either. But they reinterpreted it. They called themselves wise men. This was the Paul party. And then a number of other parties formed in the church in reaction to this. And a little bit more speculatively, the last piece of this, in the book of Acts in chapter 18, when it talks about Paul's visit to Corinth, Paul's kicked out of the synagogue, and it says that a wealthy man named Titius Justus, who was not a Jew, but he was a God-fearer, which was a non-Jew that was friendly with the synagogue, took Paul into his house. And this was a common context where a philosophical school would meet and exist, is in a household. And I think that helped contribute to the conception of some of these Corinthians that Paul's school was a little philosophical school. Okay. And I mentioned this too because this is sort of fun. It would be interesting to know if there were actually Stoic philosophers in Corinth in the first century. And that would make it easier to argue that some of the Corinthians were influenced by it. So when you do a little bit of digging, you actually find in the epigraphic record, so inscriptions, there's actually an inscription about a Corinthian Stoic man that's datable to almost exactly the same years that all of this was happening. And another Corinthian Stoic named Bacchus. There's a couple different Corinthian Stoics that we know were in town at the time. So it just helps to build a little bit of case for the plausibility that the Stoic background could indeed be the background of the division. So to come to the end, there's a whole lot more that we could have done. How does studying the background help us? And what do we really get from that?
Context.
Okay. So from this little thesis, assuming that it could be correct, has it really changed anything about your understanding of the text in positive ways that really matter?
It all seems very human nature to me.
Okay.
I mean, that's what humans are all about. Claiming wisdom, becoming comfortable, disagreements. I mean, it's all there.
That's a really good point. I mean, so just to read this as a treatise about why human wisdom is bad, well, you could get something from that. But when you read it as a text about another church that existed somewhere sometime that had problems similar to problems that have happened in churches that you've been a part of, you see, we might sort of paint the early church in this idealistic way, but they weren't. And, in some ways that might make us feel better, but it shouldn't. It says that we're still in need of reformation as well. And that unless we're taking on the attitude of Christ, and this is how Paul responds to this problem, what's the problem with the wisdom of the world that they accept is that it does make these distinctions in status. And it says, I'm better than you. Where he reminds the Corinthians, that was exactly the opposite of Jesus. First of all, God came and gave a gift to people that didn't deserve it. So looking and saying that some people are more deserving than others is not really the way that God looks at things. And Jesus himself lowered himself when he deserved more and served others instead of himself. He gave up status instead of trying to reach for it. I appreciate that point. Yeah, you can identify with it a little bit more. This is the sort of things happened before.
So fun fact, when I was in high school, I got a tract, like one of those little evangelical tracts, and one of the cartoons was somebody handing to a professor a card that had this verse on it as a way of trying to convert them. Like, you're in the wisdom of the world, not the wisdom of God. Because that's going to convert you to Christianity, apparently. But that was what the tract was about, this professor coming to Christ through that Bible verse. That was, yeah.
Yeah.
So your original thing about can you interpret this another misinterpret this?
Yes.
Definitely has been misinterpreted in many, many ways.
Good. Yeah, I'm glad that you have that example.
Yes. Yeah. And I know people who talk about not going to college because of a reading of the New Testament with verses like that.
Well, so there you go. How important is it to understand a little bit of background? It could change the entire course of your life, right? Of course, college can be bad for us in some ways, but that's not what Paul is talking about. What is the wisdom of the world? It's a wisdom that says, I'm better than you, that reaches for status, that thinks that God looks upon us with favor when we have these credentials that make us better than others. Paul says it's exactly the opposite of the way that God operates, and it's exactly the opposite of the way that Christ demonstrated for us. That's the wisdom that Paul is countering. Right? Not biology and literature. Right. Yeah, what other things? Were there other things you're like, this gives me a little bit of insight. I feel like I understand this better now. It resonates with me more now. Or just all sort of interesting historical blah, blah, blah.
It kind of makes me wonder, I've been in different denominations and heard many different preachers, and what have I been taught wrong?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
or misled.
That's a great question too. And to make you feel better about it, anybody could be wrong who thinks they're right. Right? I mean, any Bible scholar could be wrong. I mean, Bible scholars are wrong all the time. I'm wrong all the time. Your pastor can be wrong, not Meredith, but other pastors. Other pastors can be wrong sometimes.
I definitely was nervous about the fact that they recorded last week when I was doing the manuscript thing, because I was definitely wrong a couple times. What I said.
I checked over things.
Right. Yeah, but I appreciate that, and it actually sends a lot of people to school. We have a lot of people at HU that come to grad school because they said, scholar or books or somebody on TV said this or that, and I wanted to know the answers for myself. And you will learn a lot if you come and do a graduate degree, but you're not going to get all of the answers, right? You're going to get more clarity on many things that you want clarity about. We're always going to be getting some things wrong, and you don't know what those things are, right? Maybe you're getting 90% wrong, right, and 10% wrong. You just don't know where that 10% is. And that's where we don't want to put all of our faith in somebody's interpretation of it, right? We want to talk to a variety of people, study a variety of sources, seek the guidance of the Holy Spirit, and as we continue to seek, hopefully we begin to find more clarity. We recognize maybe we were wrong, recognize maybe that somebody else was wrong. But I think that knowing that we're all right and wrong sometimes should make you feel a little bit better. Does it? I don't know if it does.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So you just covered Corinthians. There's many letters that Paul is Corinthians unique, or is this kind of the same thing that he's teaching to the other churches?
Yeah.
And he's trying to support and correct their growth and their maturation.
Really good question. Again, this is part of why we know that the Corinthians were saying, I'm wise, even though Paul doesn't say, you say you're wise, is because Paul doesn't talk about wisdom. That's not one of his favorite topics. It's just suddenly there in 1 Corinthians 1 through 4, but it's almost nowhere else in his letters. That's often how we can tell what the occasion is when the language or theme is occasional, right? And it's unique to a particular letter. Now, we have a small sample size with his letters. Maybe he talked about wisdom more than we know. But yeah, that particular theme is pretty unique. Yes?
So, about Paul, so when Paul said travel to Ephesus and further south, what philosophies would he run into in that part of the world as opposed to Greece?
Further south, meaning Egypt?
No, in what is now Turkey.
Oh, the same. I mean, it was all, if you remember briefly the slide I showed, Alexander the Great, Hellenizing the world. And Greek people had settled in Turkey from centuries and centuries prior to this time. So that was the primary spoken language of the whole Mediterranean world was Greek. But to answer your question more specifically, there would have been what were called Cynic philosophers, Epicurean philosophers, Platonists and Aristotelians. But Stoics were the most numerous. It was the most popular, most successful philosophy of that time.
Were they the ones that believed in all the different gods?
Well, most of the philosophers, strangely, were monotheists. They believed that there was one ultimate reality, one mind or intellect or whatever they called it, that united and governed everything. Some of the philosophers were willing to say, well, there might be these kind of lower level deities that are all a part of that one bigger, or they might talk about the traditional, Zeus and Hermes, but they would say, well, that's just a symbol for this attribute of the one God. But yeah, philosophers typically were monotheists. So the philosophers were more like Christians in a way than those who followed any of the other traditional religions of the time, which were more based around sacrifices and making vows and reciprocity between what I offer the God and what they offer me in terms of material wealth and success. Where the philosophers emphasize, there's one God. He doesn't care so much about making you rich and famous as he does about virtue. So the philosophers there was a good starting point for Christians as Christianity broke away from Judaism. Christians realized, well, if we just start to talk the language of the philosophers, we can really reach the pagan world through that.
And this is Plato, Socrates, they're all kind of in the same time period.
So yeah, Plato and Socrates are around 400 BC. But that's the beginning of the...
were around though.
Yes.
Okay.
Particularly, Socrates didn't write anything, but for Plato, yes, Plato was very influential. And Platonism has a revival a little bit later, beginning the 2nd, 3rd century AD. Yeah, great Great questions. And if you have more, great. I just want to show you that I have a number of other resources listed at the end of the show. Quick distinction that I didn't make, primary sources versus secondary sources. Ever heard this distinction before? You ever wondered how a historian writes a textbook? Well, we read them to know history, but what do they read to write history? They read primary sources. So a historian is a secondary source, and they write based on primary sources. So these are the ancient sources themselves. If it's literature, we're talking about Second Temple Jewish literature, Greek and Roman literature. We also know a lot through Greek and Latin inscriptions, of which we have hundreds of thousands. They're collected in all these different volumes. Most of it's fragmentary, very hard to access, and really requires somebody with a specialty in that area, as well as archaeology. So those are primary sources. All the rest of this stuff, secondary sources. We talked about some of the Bible dictionaries. One that focuses on Greco-Roman or classical background as opposed to the New Testament specifically is the Oxford Classical Dictionary, which is about the same size as the Dictionary of Paul and Letters that I mentioned in his letters. Probably about, again, $50 or $60 for that. But it consists of articles. If you want to know about Plato, look under P for Plato, and it'll have a one-page article about Plato. So it's great and accessible for somebody that just wants to know a little bit and wants to find it very easily.
Going back to that first slide, why do they make it hard to access?
Oh, the epigraphy? Well, because if you think about it, ancient inscriptions, it's not like we have these buildings still standing with the letters inscribed clearly visible. We have ruins that has letters that are partially visible, and the inscriptions themselves are fragmentary. And so they take these and they have to decipher what they say, and they collect them in volumes and just put the original Greek and Latin text, often because it's not translatable in any intelligible way. And so I don't think there's any really good way to make it very accessible.
Pictures, right?
Well, they could give you pictures, but unless you know Greek and Latin and can decipher illegible letters on fragmentary.
I know, but the Bible was in Greek and Latin, and they
Yeah.
translated that. I just wonder why
Yeah.
it has to be a
That's
secret,
what AI is for.
right?
Well, with the Bible, those manuscripts are, many of them, very, very legible, written on paper, and sometimes on complete paper and complete copies.
Right. We're just not in the club.
Yeah.
On some of your sources, Jane brought up a minute ago, there is a library in town, Lanier,
Mhm.
that might have some of these books, the expensive
They would probably
ones.
have all of what I've
I
mentioned.
would think.
Yeah.
The expensive ones you were asking about, Mary, it's a free library with the theological library.
Yeah.
It's really beautiful.
We have a lot of great events there too.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. That's a good point. Yeah, you can find all of this there. It's better than HCU's library. I mean, honestly, it really
You
is.
can also do interlibrary loans, and if you're looking for a specific book, and they'll send it from anywhere in the United States, if you go through your public library.
Wow.
I mean, we have a handful of commentaries here, but we could probably start getting just a handful of, at least like the reference dictionaries to be available here.
Yeah, that'd be great. So here are some of the commentary series. I don't know if these are the sorts of series you have. These are some of the more academic ones that are usually going to reference the Greek text and Greek letters. Sometimes they'll transliterate it into English letters, but they'll still be using words that you don't recognize. There are also some more kind of lay-level commentaries. I didn't mention any of those series, but there are some journals that are more for church-going people that like to keep up in theology and biblical studies. I mentioned this, and Meredith said it was okay. I have a couple commentaries on 1 Corinthians, and this one really targets kind of educated church-going people. It's a mid-level commentary. You see it's sort of slender, so rather than going systematically part by part through every verse, it's more kind of unit by unit of the letter. But it does get into the cultural background a good bit. So I brought some of these, and I can sell them for $30. I had to buy them. You can get it on Amazon, I think, for $32. on Prime with no shipping. I think there are some advertised for $30, but they're not Prime. And so I can sell them for $30. If anybody wants one, I have. There's 5 over there, but I have actually a box of those as well. But so that's the sort of commentary, the level of commentary that might work best for you right now. So, okay, and of course, if you are interested in going back to school, we do offer a couple MA degrees. One of them is in biblical languages. It focuses on all the languages of the Bible. You take Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, and you can read the entire Bible in the original. We offer Latin as well. The second one, the MA in Classics and Early Christianity, has a language component, Greek and Latin, but it's focused around the primary sources. So we read the sources from Second Temple Judaism, from Greek and Roman authors, and from the early church fathers, just after the death of the apostles. We also offer these classes for audit. If you're not interested in degree, it's $280, I think, for a class for the semester. And you can sit in every week. The professor can send you any assignments you want, and so on. Yeah. So, how are we on time?
We're pretty close. I had to step out. Did you, so that, the dictionary of Pauline letters you mentioned earlier, it's fantastic. Is there a dictionary like that for, let's say, like the prophets?
Yes. Did I put it here? Yeah, I put it up here earlier. There's actually one for every section of the Old Testament. They're all by InterVarsity Press.
That's perfect.
Dictionary of the Pentateuch, Dictionary of the Prophets, Dictionary of the Historical Books. There's also one dictionary for Jesus and the Gospels.
Yep.
That inter what?
InterVarsity Press.
InterVarsity Press, it's a 6, if you bought it as a set, you could buy it as a 6-volume set, I think. Yeah.
So that would be like a handy, you could find anything, any context you want to in the Bible, just go look it up.
Yeah, so say you're looking at the Pentateuch,
Yeah.
and you want to know about ancient Near Eastern creation stories.
Yep.
Yeah, you're going to find, probably under C, you're going to find creation stories, Mesopotamian, something like that.
Cool. We got a few more minutes. What other questions do y'all have? Okay, cool. So your homework for this week is to take a look at your scripture and see what information you can glean about historical context that might be relevant to you. And I realize it's going to be different for everyone because you guys have scriptures from all the way across the Bible. Some are New Testament, some are Old Testament. We're going to email this out to you, so these books will be available. There's information online.
I have a couple of commentaries in my office. You have a couple
I
of
have some
commentaries
commentaries in
your
my
office.
office if you want to come read.
On yours, you can borrow those.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Historical context, just like different versions?
So by historical context, I mean anything going on in the time period when the passage was set that might be relevant. So if you've got something from the New Testament and the Gospels, chances are you're going to be reading about Roman occupation of Israel during the Second Temple period between the years 0 and 30 AD, and anything kind of just historically, culturally that might be interesting. Some of you are going to read just one or two things and that will satisfy you. Some of you are going to find yourself going down a real deep rabbit hole, and that is okay. Just read around a little bit about the context, and if you need help finding a source, email me or email Casey. Yes, ma'am.
Is there a recommended place to go to find out what the date is of the book that you're working on, or the
What passage do you have?
Revelation?
You have Revelation? Oh, I've got several great books on Revelation, actually. That's depending on who you talk to, that's in the 90s, depending on who you talk to, or earlier. That one's debated. But
If you look at the front of the book in your Bible, oftentimes they give like a one-page summary a little bit, and it oftentimes has dates.
it does. I'll tell you what, I have, before you leave, why don't I send you with my Revelation, the Revelation book from my commentary. It's got a very good introduction. That would there's a lot of context around Revelation that will be very useful to you. So that I'll just send you with that. Great. Other questions? How are we feeling? Overwhelmed? A little bit overwhelmed?
No, I
That was a
thought
lot.
I learned a lot. I appreciate your instruction, your commentary. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for coming. It's okay to feel overwhelmed. We're gonna take this one step at a time. You don't have to get everything, but by the end of this 6 weeks, you're gonna know more than you did before, right? And then the next class, we're gonna teach you Greek. I'm just kidding. Just kidding. But I've got a dream that one day we're gonna get y'all to learn Koine Greek, and you're gonna love it.
Togas.
Yes.
You'll get more attendance.
It's the wrong kind of Greek party.
Oh, okay.
So we're gonna have Greek food next week.
Greek food and togas, and we're all gonna learn. Okay, next week is the language, isn't it? Next week is the language. So we've got, I forgot his name, we've got a visiting professor coming and talking and giving, and again, you're not,
Next week's the study of taking apart your scripture, looking for words, repetition, all that.
Is it?
I think so.
I thought we switched that around.
Did we switch it?
I thought we switched it around.
Oh, then maybe I'm not next week.
Well, it's a surprise. You'll find out when you get here next week.
I thought we were next week.
We have 1 week where Casey's going to do basically literary analysis on scripture. We have 1 week where we're going to talk about language. And then the second to last week is going to be one of my favorites. The guy who led the first Israel trip I ever did and who's written a lot of books on the geography. He's got a hashtag making biblical geography meaningful, which I think is a terrible hashtag, but it's like a great topic. And he's got a fantastic video series, and he is going to zoom in because he lives in Wisconsin. But he's going to zoom in and do a session for us. And the class I took with him was life changing. So I'm just hoping to get you guys a glimpse of that. So that's basically the series, and then I'm going to do a wrap up the last week. Okay? All right, let's close it out with a prayer. Gracious God, we are so, so grateful for any time that we have spent in your word. And we pray right now for all of these servants gathered here. God, we pray that you would open our minds and our hearts as we encounter you in the word this week. God, I pray that nothing would stand in the way of our discipleship and our search for growth and our love for you. God, I pray that you would open up the time every single day for us to encounter you in the reading of the word, in the breaking of bread, and the fellowship of the disciples. God, wherever we meet you, we pray that you would open our hearts and open our minds and help us to prioritize our love of you. Come, Holy Spirit, keep us safe as we go out into the evening, keep us attentive, and keep our hearts close to your heart. This we pray in your name. Amen. Amen. Thank you, guys.